Alright, so the other day, I stumbled upon this fear called Navy phobia. Now, this is a fear directed toward cruise ships, and I'm just going to assume it's probably because people see the Titanic film and think, well, the Titanic is a cruise ship and it sank, therefore all cruise ships are unsafe. Well, over the past 100 years, technology has evolved a lot. And the Titanic wasn't even a cruise ship. In fact, throughout the entire history of cruise ships, there have only technically been like 10 or so ships that have actually sunk. The other couple cruise ships that have sunk are just cruise ships that were abandoned and left at their moorings, therefore sank. But today I'm gonna break your fear of ships by showing you all the sinkings of cruise ships, and then showing you how many cruise ships currently sail the waters today, and also reminding you that most of these sinkings happened a while ago, and since 2012 there has not been a single cruise ship sinking. The first ship we'll be talking about is the Achille Lauro. Some of you might know this ship from either a couple of videos, the video footage posted online of her sinking, or the Bright Sun Films documentary. But if you don't know this ship, basically she was originally built as a Dutch ocean liner for the Northeastern Lloyd Line. Eventually she was sold to Star Lauro Cruises, and after many instances like fire and hijacking, she began her last voyage, and while off the coast of Somalia, a fire broke out in her engine room, and she began to sink. As people used pool water to try to shovel it into the bowels of the ship to put out the fire, it just made the ship list. And Moss Hills, who was actually the guy who was on the famous Oceanos and rescued everyone on there, was also on the Achille Lauro and another ship we'll be discussing later. He actually managed to help over 100 people off the back of the ship, including the remaining crew on the bridge. The ship eventually succumbed to the fire and capsized and sank after an explosion. From what I've heard, there has been no attempt to find the wreck, considering she's off the coast of Somalia, which is really unstable, and as well as that, she's actually deeper than the Titanic. This ship was built for the Black Sea Shipping Company as an Ivan Franko-class ocean liner. Eventually, the Soviets realized not only was people not going to go on their ocean liners, but ocean liner travel itself was being phased out. Eventually, the ship was painted white and assigned to cruises around New Zealand. In 1986, however, the ship departed Wellington for one of her scheduled cruises. However, the harbor pilot must have not been feeling so well that day, and so he drove the ship into an area between a lighthouse and the land with very shallow rocks, and the Mikhail Lermontov struck one of them. Eventually, they stopped the ship, and I believe no one died on the ship. Today, she's a very popular diving attraction, and it's actually very eerie how much of her is intact. This ship was originally built as the Lindblad Explorer. She was the first ever purpose-built expeditionary cruise ship and set many records for expeditionary cruising over her career. After switching many hands and being named such as Lindblad Explorer, Society Explorer, and eventually Explorer, she was sold to Gap Shipping and retained the Explorer name. In 2007, she was making a cruise to the Antarctic Peninsula, but the passengers had to turn back, mainly just because the ship could not make it to the Antarctic Peninsula due to the seasonal ice. They decided to go to Penguin Island, which technically wasn't continental Antarctica, so the passengers would get a small refund, but not really by much, and they still would land somewhere. However, as the captain was acting like the ship was an icebreaker for some strange reason, an iceberg, no surprise, ripped through the hull, just like the Titanic. Eventually, water began flooding into the cabins, and after power was restored to the ship, the evacuation began, and the MS Nordnorg went and picked up the survivors. From what I've heard, there's been no expedition of the wreck, so let's hope someone does that someday. Although really, who would want to go to the depths of Antarctica? It's cold there. The Costa Concordia was built in 2005 for Costa Cruise Lines. During her christening, the bottle of champagne failed to break, and she had many incidents over her career. On Friday the 13th, 100 years after the Titanic sank, with an horrible captain, the ship set sail. The stars were pretty much aligning for the ship to end. And she did. The crew miscalculated how close they were to shore while doing a sail-by salute of the island of Giglio. During that, the ship hit the rocks and sank. However, the wind worked in the favor, blowing the ship back to shore, and she grounded on rocks. The rocks stopped her from sinking any further, and only 30 people died. In fact, the captain actually refused to get on when the actual Italian Navy told him to. He was sentenced to 16 years in jail in 2017, and honestly, that's probably the best place to be at this time during COVID. Eventually, in 2014, the ship was raised. Today, there is nothing left of the ship, and she was scrapped after being towed to a scrapyard in Italy. She was originally built as a Norwegian cargo liner, and she was called the Oslo Fjord. Eventually, she was sold to Costa Cruises, and in 1970, she caught fire and sank. There's not really much else to say about this ship. Before we continue, I'm just gonna go some honorable mentions out of the way. The Wilhelm Gustloff was actually the worst ever cruise ship sinking ever, and the worst ship sinking in history, with a whopping 9,000 deaths, which is just crazy to think. In fact, many people afraid of cruise ships use this as perfect grounds to describe why cruise ships are bad and unsafe. The ship was originally made for Nazis working in the war to have a break from the war and just go on a relaxing cruise. Eventually, though, when Poland was being captured by the Allies, the ship was overcrowded with people and sent to Germany. Now, an overcrowded ship sailing in a war zone with Soviet subs approaching does not seem like a good thing, and that's exactly why this does not count, really, for a cruise ship sinking to me, and it's because this was wartime. The S-13 shot 3 torpedoes at the Gustloff, which sank it. Over time, 9,000 people would die in the water from either getting trampled inside the ship, drowning, or being depth-charged accidentally by the rescue ships that came there, thinking S-13 was still in the area. The ship was originally built as the MS Galileo Galilei. Eventually, after many other owners, she was sold to Sun Cruises and renamed Sun Vista. There was actually a big Hollywood movie, which I forgot the name of because I'm an idiot, and it was filmed on this ship. However, the voyage immediately after the movie was filled with tragedy, and much like the Achille Lauro, due to an engine room fire. The passengers were evacuated and the ship sank. Fortunately, no one died on this one. Today, she is actually still a famous wreck, and many people dive to her. The ship was originally used as an ocean liner by Costa. Eventually, though, her route was from Italy to Venezuela, mainly just because when you draw a straight line from Italy all the way across the ocean, you can actually reach Venezuela, which is why it's named Venezuela. It's not a joke, I'm actually serious. However, on one of these routes, the ship suffered an engine room fire again, and she sank. Because the ship is actually not that deep, it's a popular dive destination in Grenada. However, some of the ship isn't really noticeable considering the whole thing kind of collapsed in on itself after the fire was partly extinguished. If you're ever in Grenada, I'd highly advise checking it out. She was originally built as a Jeanne Laborn. Funny enough, the ship actually at one point had a blue hull paint, which I really liked just for some reason. Eventually, though, in 1991, the ship was off the coast of South Africa when a water filtration system burst. Because a pipe was under for maintenance, and the pipe led through bulkheads, the water was able to seep into said pipe and go through bulkheads, therefore guaranteeing the ship would sink. Now, the incredible thing is that basically all the crew, except for the captain who did nothing, abandoned ship, and the entertainers, such as Moss Hills, who's the guy we talked about before on the who would be in future on the Achille Lauro, and also would eventually go on the Costa Concordia. He actually told someone to go to the bridge and call for help. Choppers arrived, and he helped coordinate the rescue, saving tons of people from 3 separate cruise ship disasters. That is crazy. The ship was originally built for the Holland America line and was extremely small. However, she was beloved by many, and in 1980 was sailing off the coast of Alaska. The mood was calm and the voyage was nice. However, a fire broke out in the engine room, and about an hour later they sent out an SOS. The Prinsendam then evacuated all of her passengers onto lifeboats and waited for the US Coast Guard's assistance. Incredibly, all 520 people were rescued. However, the Prinsendam succumbed to the fire and sits off the coast of Alaska till this day. She was originally built as the Barca Princess for Barca Cruises. Eventually she went under a huge renovation and was then sold to Lois Cruises and renamed to Sea Diamond. It was actually around this time that my parents were on her and used her as a ferry. In fact, funny story, they said that they actually were not trained for the muster drills because the ship, they were not staying overnight on the ship. Therefore, they were not told what to do if in an emergency. This was before the Concordia disaster, by the way. However, they said, what if the ship sunk? What would we do? And then 2 years later, the ship struck rocks off the island of Santorini. The ship began to really slowly sink, and that was mainly just because she was resting up against the rocks like the Concordia, just sitting there, pretty much. However, eventually she was towed out, and I'll show footage here of her final plunge. The ship continues to pollute Santorini till this day, and there's plans to raise the ship, but those aren't really going so well at the moment. Now, it may seem a little counterintuitive why I'm making this video about why you shouldn't fear cruise ships and mention every single cruise ship that has sunk so far. Well, it's because I want to prove a point that the last cruise ship that ever fully sank was in 2012, and even then there was only 30 deaths out of over 1,000 people. We shouldn't really be judging past mistakes over the safety of current cruise ships, and safety on cruise ships has come a long way. Yes, there have been other deaths on cruise ships due to various other incidents, but cruise ships are relatively safe. Over the millions of people that cruise on ships per year, less than 10 people die on cruise ships per year. Now, those are pretty good odds if you ask me, although most of it probably has to do with the fact that most cruise ships aren't cruising at the moment due to COVID. But still, cruise ships shouldn't be judged on the past mistakes, which weren't really that serious. Besides, of course, the Wilhelm Gustloff, which is in a whole separate category considering it was literally in 1940s, and it was due to wartime reasons. Cruise ships today are much safer, much funner, and you're not very likely to get in trouble or die on them. Anyways, if I missed any cruise ships that have sank, do let me know, and I probably will give them their own video eventually, just to say sorry. As well as that, there were other cruise ships that sunk at port, just because they were so old and flooded with water, but that was just because they were abandoned and no one took care of them. Therefore, it doesn't really count, because it wasn't an accident. So, will the Sea Diamond ever be raised? Will I finally figure out what ships I missed? And will I ever find more stock footage like the one I found now? That's a very good question.